Let's dive right in. Investment banks are sitting on an absolute goldmine of information, a treasure trove of intelligence they've collected over decades. But here's the big question. How do they actually unlock it? Today, we're going to explore how AI is becoming the key to activating these sleeping assets and turning all that dormant data into a real strategic weapon.
But this brings up a fascinating paradox, right? If this data is so incredibly valuable, why isn't it already being used? Why is this treasure locked away in a vault that nobody seems to have the key for? That's the central mystery we're going to unravel.
And this is what's being called the data paradox. It's this strange situation where you have these immense riches, this incredible wealth of information, but it's almost completely inaccessible to the very systems that could turn it into something useful.
And just look at what's actually in this vault. We are not just talking about numbers in a spreadsheet. This is hours and hours of roadshow recordings, super detailed private placement memos, complex email threads with clients, even old scanned paper contracts and audio from phone calls. All of it is rich, it's nuanced, it's human information.
And here's the real kicker. A staggering 80% of a typical bank's data is estimated to be unstructured. So what does that mean? It means it's not in neat little rows and columns. It's text, it's audio, it's images, formats that traditional computer models just can't understand. It's just sitting there, silent.
Look, this isn't just about being a little more efficient. This is a massive strategic opportunity. The first company that really activates this dark data, making it all searchable and actionable, they will build a business moat so wide and deep that it's going to be nearly impossible for anyone else to cross. So, to get there, we need a really fundamental shift in our thinking. We have to move from a world where we just store data to a world where we truly understand knowledge. And that requires a completely new set of rules for how we govern data. And this really shows you how huge the change is. The old way was all about fields and tables, forcing information into these rigid little boxes. But the new way, which is powered by AI, is all about semantics and connections. It's not about where the data is stored anymore. It's about what it means and how it relates to everything else.
One of the core technologies that makes this happen is the knowledge graph. Now, I want you to think of it less like a database and more like a social network for your data. It doesn't just store individual facts. It actually maps out the web of connections between them, and that reveals patterns you would never, ever see otherwise.
So let's make this real with an example. A traditional database, it just sees 3 totally separate facts. But a knowledge graph connects them. It sees, okay, this client is a tech executive, and it links that to their company's dividend plan from a public filing. And then it connects that to an old email where they mentioned an interest in green energy. Bam! Suddenly you have a highly personalized, totally actionable insight.
But for the AI to create all these amazing connections, it needs to speak a pretty special language. And this brings us to a process that, honestly, feels a little bit like modern alchemy, the magic of vectorization. Here's the most important thing to get your head around. AI doesn't read text or listen to a phone call like you and I do. It doesn't really understand concepts, it understands math. So all of that rich human language has to be translated into a form it can actually calculate.
And that translation process, it's called vectorization, or sometimes embedding. It's basically a way of turning a word or a sentence or even a whole image into a set of numerical coordinates in this giant multidimensional space. The trick is that things with similar meanings end up close to each other in this space. And that allows the AI to understand context and nuance, but mathematically. Pretty cool, right?
But, and this is a big but, you can't just use some off-the-shelf generic model for this. In finance, context is everything. Think about a word like exposure. It means something totally different to a banker than it does in a normal conversation. You have to have custom models trained on financial vocabulary to capture that level of precision. And crucially, you can build this whole system for security, creating separate vector libraries for public data, internal data, and the super-sensitive client data.
So that brings us to the elephant in the room, the most important question of all. How in the world do you do all this while protecting the crown jewels? In finance, data security and client privacy are, completely non-negotiable.
Thankfully, the security technology here is just as advanced as the AI itself. With something called federated learning, a model can be trained across different countries without the raw data ever leaving its home server. Think of it like sending the teacher to the students instead of the other way around. Then there's synthetic data, which creates realistic but completely anonymous client profiles for training. And finally, dynamic masking acts like a smart filter, hiding sensitive info in real time depending on who is asking the question.
Okay, so we've covered the what, the why, and the all-important security. Now for the most important part, the how. This isn't just a cool theory. There's a clear, actionable roadmap to actually unlocking this vault.
The path forward really has 3 key steps. First, you have to take an inventory. You got to know what you have. Find those high-value sources like client interviews or analyst notes. Second, you have to build a unified foundation, a single vector storage center so everyone is working from the same source of truth. And third, and this is so important, you must create a feedback loop where your human experts are constantly correcting and refining the AI's suggestions, which makes it smarter and smarter over time.
And it all really comes down to this key insight. Data asset thickness determines AI capability height. What does that really mean? It means it's not just about having a lot of data. It's about the depth, the quality, and the richness of that data. That's what will ultimately determine just how powerful your AI can become.
You know, at the end of the day, any firm can go out and buy a powerful AI model. That part's becoming a commodity. The real differentiating work, the heavy lifting that builds that insurmountable moat, is the patient, strategic process of cleaning, organizing, and activating the unique proprietary data that you've been collecting for years.
So I'll leave you with this final thought. As data just keeps growing and growing, is the information inside your organization an incredible, untapped asset that's just waiting to be activated? Or is it becoming a forgotten liability? The answer to that question will likely define the winners and losers of the next decade.